Michelle, is he your father? Yes. Robert,
Have we met?
you don't recognize me.
Should I?
Savannah, 28 years ago.
What are you doing here?
I'm so sorry. This marriage can't happen.
Mom, what do you mean by that?
Because this man standing here is your father. Wait, what? Wait, what?
My name is Michelle Carter, and 6 months ago, the biggest decision in my life was choosing between two wedding venues. One had a garden, one had a ballroom. I remember losing sleep over it, laughing with my mother about how ridiculous it was to stress over flowers and lighting when the man I loved had already given me everything that mattered. I never could have imagined that the moment I'm about to tell you about was waiting for me. I never could have imagined that the happiest season of my life was about to become the most painful chapter one would ever live through. I need to start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how deeply Daniel and I loved each other. This wasn't a whirlwind romance. This wasn't something either of us rushed into. This was 6 years built slowly, brick by brick, and I need you to understand that before I tell you how it ended. I met Daniel when I was 23. I was working at a marketing firm in Atlanta, still fairly new to the job, still trying to prove myself in a building full of people who seemed to already know exactly what they were doing. Daniel was doing freelance photography for one of our client accounts, a small furniture company that wanted new catalog images. He walked into a conference room 15 minutes late, wearing a jacket that didn't match his shoes, apologizing because his car had stalled twice on the way over. Something about the way he laughed at his own bad luck made me smile before he even said a word directly to me. He had this habit of running his hand through his hair when he was nervous, and he did it 3 separate times during that meeting, and I remember thinking that a grown man who photographed furniture for a living had no business being that endearing. We started talking after that meeting ended. Just small talk in the hallway at first, about traffic, about the client, about nothing important. Then he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime to go over a few shot ideas, which we both knew was really just an excuse to see each other again. The coffee turned into dinner 2 weeks later. The dinner turned into phone calls that stretched past midnight, then past 1 in the morning, both of us too stubborn to be the one who said goodnight first. Daniel was easy to love in a way that surprised me. He remembered small things about me that most people never bothered to notice. He knew I hated cilantro before I ever had to tell him twice. He knew I got anxious during thunderstorms because of something that happened when I was 8 years old, and he never made me explain it. He just started calling me during storms to keep me distracted until they passed. He was steady, not exciting in a loud way, but steady in the way that mattered more the longer I knew him. I had grown up watching my parents work through some genuinely hard years in their own marriage, years of money stress and long silences at the dinner table, and by the time I met Daniel, study wasn't boring to me. Study felt like safety. We dated for almost 6 years. 6 years of birthday dinners and holiday traditions and road trips down to the coast where we'd argue about directions and always end up laughing about it later. 6 years of him showing up at my apartment with soup when I was sick, and me sitting in the waiting room during his minor surgery, and both of our families slowly weaving themselves into each other's lives until nobody could quite remember what it felt like before Daniel was just there at every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner. My family loved him, my father especially. Dad and Daniel would disappear onto the back porch for hours, talking about nothing important: football scores, truck engines, whatever was on the news that week. I used to watch them through the kitchen window while I helped my mother with dishes, and I remember thinking I was the luckiest woman alive because the two most important men in my life genuinely, easily liked each other. There was no tension there, no forced politeness. Just two people who had somehow become family to each other before it was even official. Daniel's mother, Patricia, was a little more reserved with me at first. She was protective of her son in a way I understood completely once I got to know her better. It had mostly just been the two of them for most of his life. His father had never been in the picture, not even a little. Daniel didn't talk about it much when the subject came up, and I never pushed him on it, because I could see it wasn't a wound he wanted opened. All I really knew was that his mother had raised him on her own in Savannah before moving to Atlanta when he was in middle school, chasing better work and a fresh start, and that whatever had happened with his father was something that changed the temperature of the room whenever it got mentioned. Over time, Patricia warmed to me. By our third year together, she was calling me her daughter before Daniel had even proposed. Usually while we were cooking together in her kitchen, her hands moving through recipes she'd learned from her own mother. By year 5, she was helping me flip through bridal magazines during the holidays, dog-earing pages like the wedding was already decided, like it was only a matter of when, not if. There was one trip in our 4th year together that I still think about more than almost any other memory we made. We drove down to Tybee Island for a long weekend, just the two of us. No plan except to sit on the beach and eat too much seafood. On the second night, we walked out to the pier after dinner, and Daniel stopped in the middle of it, leaned against the railing, and told me that whatever happened in his life from that point forward, he wanted me standing next to him for it. He wasn't proposing yet. He was just telling me the truth, plainly, the way he always did. I remember the wind pulling my hair across my face, and thinking that I had never felt more certain of anything. We came home from that trip and started talking more seriously about a future together, about where we might eventually live, about how many kids we both wanted, which was 2. We agreed on that easily, one of the few things in life that felt simple between us. We started saving a little more carefully. We started looking at rings without either of us saying out loud that we were looking at rings, both of us pretending we were just browsing. And then, last spring, it became official. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday, which he thought was hilarious, because he said he didn't want me to spend the rest of my life associating our engagement with some overdone holiday like Valentine's Day. He got down on one knee right there in our kitchen, still wearing his work clothes, flowers still on the counter from dinner, and his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the ring box twice before he got the lid open. I said yes before he even finished asking the question. I didn't even let him get through the whole sentence. I just said yes, and then I said it again, and then I was crying and laughing at the same time while he tried to figure out where he'd put the ring. Both of our families were thrilled. My mother cried on the phone for a solid 10 minutes when I called her. My father hugged Daniel so hard, I genuinely thought he might crack a rib. Patricia flew in from Savannah, where she still had family and old friends, and the two of us spent an entire weekend curled up on my couch going through wedding magazines, imagining a future that felt like it was already halfway real, already halfway ours. We started planning a big engagement dinner so both families could formally celebrate together before the real wedding planning got serious. My parents offered to host it at their house, the same house I grew up in, the same dining room where I'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners. It felt right. It felt like the natural next chapter in a love story that had already lasted 6 years and survived every ordinary test a relationship can survive. I spent nearly 2 weeks preparing for that dinner, like it was the wedding itself. I picked out a dress 3 separate times before settling on one. My mother had the good china out on the table, the set she only used for Christmas and Easter. My father grilled for 2 days straight because he refused to let a caterer touch what he kept calling, only half joking, a family moment. The night of the dinner, our house was full of noise and laughter in a way I hadn't heard in years. Aunts I hadn't seen since my college graduation showed up early to help set the table. Daniel's cousins had driven up from Savannah that morning just for the occasion. There was music playing low in the background, the smell of my father's barbecue drifting through every room, and I remember standing in the hallway for a moment just soaking it in, thinking that this was what happiness was supposed to feel like. Patricia arrived a little later than everyone else, apologizing for traffic on the highway, carrying a dish she'd made from her own mother's recipe, something she'd promised to bring for weeks. I remember watching her walk through our front door, brushing rain off her shoulders, and thinking how strange and wonderful it was that in a few months she would legally be my mother-in-law. That the woman standing in my parents' entryway was about to become family in every sense of the word, not just in the loose, easy way she already was. My father came around the corner from the kitchen to greet her, the same way he'd greeted every other guest that night, warm, relaxed, already reaching his hand out. And then something happened that I still can't fully explain, even now, even after everything that followed. They both stopped moving. It wasn't a normal pause, the kind that happens when two people are simply being polite. It was the kind of stillness that makes an entire room go quiet before anyone even understands why. My father's hand was still half extended, hanging in the air. Patricia's mouth had opened slightly, like she was about to say something and had forgotten the words halfway through forming them. My mother noticed first. She had been carrying a serving tray toward the table, and she set it down slowly, watching the two of them with an expression I had never once seen on her face in 26 years of being her daughter. "Robert," Patricia finally said, her voice quiet. "Robert Carter." My father looked confused, his eyebrows pulling together. "I'm sorry, have we met? You really don't remember me." The room had gone almost completely silent by then. Conversations that had been happening in every corner of the house seemed to fade out at once. Daniel was standing near me, and I felt him go still too, the same stillness that had taken over his mother. "Patricia, I don't understand what's happening right now," my father said, and I could hear something new in his voice, something uncertain that I had never heard from him before. "You left Savannah without ever knowing I was pregnant." My mother stepped forward, one hand pressed flat against her chest. "Pregnant with what?" "With his child." I felt my whole body go cold, starting somewhere in my stomach and spreading outward until my fingers felt numb. I looked at Daniel, hoping desperately that he would say something, that he would laugh, that anyone in that room would break the tension with an explanation that made this all some strange, absurd misunderstanding we'd be retelling as a funny story years from now. Nobody did. "Mom, what are you saying?" Daniel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the kind of whisper that comes out when a person already suspects the answer and is terrified to hear it confirmed. "I'm saying you have a sister sitting right there."
She pointed at me.
"I want to tell you that I fainted or screamed or did something dramatic enough to match the size of what I was feeling in that moment. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, listening to a story I never asked to be part of unfold in my parents' living room while a tray of appetizers sat untouched on the table beside me. Patricia's voice was shaking, but she kept talking, like she had been holding this in for almost 30 years and finally had nowhere left to put it. She told us that she and my father had known each other briefly in Savannah, long before he ever met my mother, during a stretch of time he'd spent working construction jobs there before he eventually settled in Atlanta for good. She said it hadn't been a long relationship, nothing either of them had considered serious at the time, just a few months during a period when they were both young and figuring out their lives. She said she found out she was pregnant a few weeks after he had already packed up and moved back home. She had no way to reach him, no number that still worked, no address. Just a first name and a general idea of where he was originally from. She raised Daniel on her own from that point forward. She told us she never explained who his father was, not because she was hiding something cruel, but because she genuinely didn't have a way to find him, and after enough years passed, it felt kinder, or maybe just easier, to let that chapter of her life stay closed rather than chase a ghost. My father sat down slowly in one of our dining chairs, his face pale, his hands pressed against his forehead like he was trying to hold his own thoughts together. My mother had gone completely silent, staring at a version of her husband's past she never knew existed, a version that had apparently been sitting quietly in our family history for almost 3 decades, waiting for the wrong moment to surface. I looked at Daniel.
He was already looking at me.
And in that look, I understood that he was doing the exact same math I was doing in my head, counting backward, realizing that the man he had called sir for 6 years, the man who had taught him how to change a tire in our driveway and welcomed him into our family without a shred of hesitation, was his biological father, which meant I wasn't his fiancé anymore. I was his sister. The rest of that night is honestly a blur to me, even now, months later. I remember Patricia crying, apologizing over and over to no one in particular. I remember Daniel's cousins quietly gathering their coats and slipping out the front door without saying much of anything, unsure how to be present for something that clearly wasn't meant for them to witness. I remember my mother sitting at the kitchen table with her hands pressed over her face, and my father standing alone in the backyard for almost an hour, staring at nothing, his silhouette barely visible in the porch light. I don't remember who eventually told the caterer to stop serving food nobody was going to eat. I don't remember exactly when the engagement dinner officially ended, only that at some point, hours later, everyone was gone, and the house that had been full of laughter earlier that evening felt like it belonged to strangers. The wedding was canceled before anyone even had to say the words out loud. There was nothing left to plan. There was no version of our future together that made sense anymore, no version that anyone in either family could look at and say, yes, this can still happen. For the first few days afterward, I barely left my room. My mother would knock softly, leave food outside my door, and I'd hear her walk away without saying anything, because there was truly nothing to say that would have made any of it easier. I kept replaying 6 years of my life over and over in my mind, searching for some sign I had missed, some clue, some strange feeling I had ignored, and finding absolutely nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Neither Daniel nor I had done anything wrong. We had simply loved someone we were never supposed to meet in that way, through circumstances neither of us had any control over, decades before either of us was even born. My best friend, Renee, came by about 4 days in, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years earlier. She didn't say much at first. She just sat on the edge of my bed and let me talk in circles for almost 2 hours, the same sentences over and over, different order each time, like I was trying to rearrange the facts into something that made more sense. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer advice. She just stayed, and I think that was the only thing that kept me from completely falling apart that week. Daniel called me once, about a week after everything happened. Neither of us knew what to say. We sat on the phone in silence for almost 2 full minutes, just breathing before he finally said my name, quietly, the way he used to say it when we were falling asleep on the phone together in the early years of dating. Hearing him say it that way, like nothing had changed, was more than I could handle. I hung up before he could say anything else, because I couldn't bear to hear him sound like the person he used to be to me. We didn't speak again after that. I went back to work about 2 weeks later. Mostly because I couldn't afford to keep using my paid time off, and partly because I needed somewhere to put my mind other than that house. My manager, a kind woman named Teresa who had been through her own hard year a while back, pulled me into her office my first day back and simply said that my desk would be there whenever I was ready for it. No explanations required. I appreciated that more than she probably ever knew. I wasn't ready to explain any of it to coworkers who only knew me as the woman who used to talk about wedding venues over lunch. Renee kept checking on me almost daily, showing up with takeout some nights, other nights just texting to make sure I'd eaten something. She never once told me how I should feel, which I think is rarer than people realize. She let me be angry when I needed to be angry, and let me cry when I needed to cry, and she never rushed me toward whatever version of okay everyone else seemed to expect from me. My father tried, in his own quiet way, to talk to me about what happened. He came to my apartment one evening about 3 weeks after the dinner, sat at my small kitchen table, and told me he had spent every day since replaying that summer in Savannah trying to understand how he could have walked away from someone's life so completely without ever knowing what he'd left behind. He wasn't asking me to forgive him. He said he didn't think that was something he deserved yet, maybe not ever. He just wanted me to know he understood that his past had reached forward and taken something from me that I never should have had to lose. I didn't have much to say to him that night. I just let him sit there, and eventually I made us both coffee, and we didn't talk about it again for a long while after that. People kept telling me it would get easier with time. My coworkers said I was young, that I would meet someone else eventually, that this would become a strange story I told at parties one day instead of an open wound. My aunt told me it was probably a blessing in disguise, that some higher power had stopped something terrible from happening before it was too late. But nobody around me seemed to understand that I wasn't mourning a breakup. I was mourning a person who was still alive, still in the world, still capable of loving me the exact way he always had, except now that love was something neither of us was allowed to touch, something that had to be relabeled overnight from romantic to forbidden. I went through phases of anger I barely recognized in myself. I was angry at my father for a relationship he'd had almost 30 years before I was even born. I was angry at Patricia for a secret she never actually meant to keep, a secret that was never really hers to keep in the first place. I was angry at Daniel, even though some part of me knew it wasn't fair, simply because looking at him reminded me of everything I had lost in the space of a single evening. Mostly, I was angry at whatever force in the universe had allowed two people to fall in love for 6 years without a single warning sign, without a single moment where the truth could have surfaced before we built an entire future on top of it. 2 months passed like that, slow and heavy. I started going back to work, though I moved through most days like I was underwater. I started sleeping through the night again, most nights, though I still woke up some mornings reaching for a phone that no longer had any messages from him. I told myself I was healing, slowly, the way everyone kept promising I would. Then one morning, I woke up feeling sick before I'd even gotten out of bed. I blamed it on stress at first, on the 6 months of upheaval my body had been through. Then it happened again the next morning. And the morning after that. I sat in my bathroom with a pregnancy test in my hands for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself look at it. 2 lines. I was pregnant. With Daniel's child. I sat down on the cold bathroom floor and stayed there for what felt like an hour, staring at the tile grout, trying to process something my mind kept refusing to fully accept. Because this wasn't simply an unplanned pregnancy. This was a child conceived months before either of us ever knew the truth about who we really were to each other, a child who would grow up carrying a story most people never have to carry in their entire lives. When I finally told my parents, sitting across from them at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast my whole childhood, the room went quiet in a way that felt eerily similar to that night at the engagement dinner. My mother sat down slowly, her hand covering her mouth. My father didn't speak for a long time, just stared at a spot on the table like he could somehow will himself out of the conversation. Then the opinions started coming from nearly every direction I turned. Some relatives said I needed to end the pregnancy immediately, that there was no version of this story that could end well for me, that I owed it to myself and to any future child to make this disappear quietly before word got out any further. Others said I should have thought more carefully before things ever got physical with Daniel in the first place, as if either of us had any possible way of knowing what we were walking into 6 years earlier. I heard nearly every opinion a person could have about what I should do with my own body and my own future, from people who meant well and people who clearly didn't, except for the one opinion that actually mattered, which was mine and which nobody seemed particularly interested in asking about. I spent weeks in that uncertainty, turning the decision over in my mind from every possible angle, some nights barely sleeping at all. I thought about the medical questions people whispered about behind my back, questions I eventually brought to my own doctor, sitting in a small exam room asking about genetic counseling and what it might mean for this specific pregnancy. I thought about what it would mean to raise a child who would eventually ask questions about their father, questions I wasn't sure I would ever have gentle enough answers for. I thought about the life I had planned with Daniel, a life that no longer existed in any form, and how strange it felt that a piece of that life was still growing quietly inside me regardless. I even sat down with a therapist for the first time in my life, a woman named Dr. Alvarez who Renee had recommended, and I remember telling her the whole story from the beginning, watching her face carefully for judgment that never actually came. She helped me understand that grief doesn't always look the way we expect it to, that I was allowed to grieve a relationship, a future, and a version of my father I thought I knew, all at the same time, without any of those griefs canceling each other out. I told Renee about the pregnancy before I told anyone else, sitting in her car outside my apartment because I couldn't say it out loud inside for walls that had heard too much already that year. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask the question everyone else kept asking first, the one about what I was going to do. She just reached over, took my hand, and asked how I was feeling, which was the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment. She told me later that night, after I'd calmed down enough to really talk, that whatever I decided, she would be there for every appointment, every hard day, every part of it, and she has kept that promise every single week since. My mother took longer to come around than I expected. For the first few days after I told her, she barely spoke to me about it directly, moving through the house in a kind of careful silence I recognized from years of watching her handle hard things quietly rather than loudly. Then one night she knocked on my door, sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was a teenager with a problem too big for me to solve alone, and told me that whatever I chose, she wasn't going anywhere. She said she couldn't pretend to have answers for a situation nobody in our family had ever imagined having to face, but she could promise to be my mother through every part of it, and that promise meant more to me than she probably realized. But somewhere in the middle of all that noise, all those weeks of other people's opinions pressing in on me from every side, I kept coming back to one simple, quiet thought that refused to leave me alone. This child, whatever their future looked like, however complicated their story would eventually become, hadn't asked for any of this. They didn't choose the circumstances of how they came into existence any more than Daniel or I had chosen the family history that made our relationship impossible to continue. I thought about my own life, about how none of us actually get to choose the truth we're born into, only how we eventually choose to respond once we learn it. My father didn't choose to have a son he never knew about. Daniel didn't choose to grow up without a father. I didn't choose to fall in love with my own brother. None of us chose any of it, but every single one of us still had to choose what came next. There were nights during those weeks when I genuinely didn't know which way I would land. I would fall asleep leaning one direction and wake up leaning the other, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how much the decisions seemed to shift depending on how well I'd slept or how many opinions I'd been forced to sit through that day. Dr. Alvarez told me that was normal, that a decision this size doesn't usually arrive all at once, it arrives in pieces, and eventually the pieces settle into something that feels less like a choice and more like a truth you've been circling the whole time. I made my decision alone, in my apartment, late on a night when the rest of the world felt very far away and very quiet. I decided I was going to have this baby, and I was going to figure out the rest as it came, one day at a time, the same way I had been forced to figure out everything else since the night my entire future changed in my parents' living room over a tray of appetizers nobody ever got to eat. There was one night, about a month after I decided to keep the pregnancy, when I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, Daniel's name pulled up on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button for almost 20 minutes. I typed out a message 3 different times and deleted it 3 different times. I wanted to tell him. Some part of me still felt like he deserved to know before anyone else outside my immediate family did. But every time I got close to sending anything, I thought about what it would actually mean for him to hear those words, that the woman he had once planned to marry was now pregnant with his child under circumstances neither of us could have ever prepared for, and I couldn't make myself press send. I put the phone down that night and told myself I would find the right words eventually. I'm still looking for them. I heard through my aunt, who still talks to Patricia occasionally, that Daniel moved to Charlotte a few months ago for a new job, a fresh start in a city where nobody knew the story. I understood that completely. I've thought about leaving Atlanta myself more than once, though something always keeps me here, maybe my parents, maybe Renee, maybe just the stubborn feeling that I shouldn't have to be the one who disappears from her own life because of the truth someone else was carrying. I haven't told Daniel yet. I don't know when I will, or exactly how, or what it will mean for either of us once I do. I don't know what kind of relationship, if any, this child will eventually have with their father, or with the brother I once believed I was going to spend the rest of my life married to. I don't know how my parents' relationship will hold together under the weight of everything that came out that night, though they are trying, slowly, in the careful way people try to rebuild something after an earthquake. I don't know how I'm going to explain any of this one day to a child who deserves the truth, but doesn't deserve to carry the full weight of it before they're old enough to understand what any of it means. All I know is that 6 months ago, I genuinely believed the hardest decision I would ever have to make in my life was choosing between a garden and a ballroom. Now I'm preparing to raise a child on my own, carrying a story I never asked to be part of, trying to build some kind of steady future out of a truth that shattered the one I thought I already had. Some days I catch myself standing in the nursery I've barely started putting together, one hand resting on my stomach, and I feel something close to peace, a quiet certainty that whatever else happened, this part of my life is still mine to build. Other days, the weight of it catches up with me all at once, usually late at night, and I let myself cry for the wedding that never happened, for the version of my father I used to believe in without question, for the 6 years I spent loving someone the world would no longer let me love that way. I don't regret the years I spent with Daniel, even now. I've thought about that a lot, whether I should feel differently looking back, whether those years should feel tainted somehow by what we eventually learned. But I don't think they do. We loved each other honestly, with everything we had, inside the only truth either of us knew at the time. What came after wasn't a betrayal. It was just life, cracking open a door none of us knew was there, and showing us something we were never meant to carry alone. If you were standing in my shoes, knowing everything I know now, what would you have done? I'd really like to know what you think. Tell me in the comments below, and if this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed, because there's more where this came from.